All right, gentlemen, hi. So I wanted to start off by saying that I am a massive fan of your previous film, Searching. And I love that movie. That was one of my favorite films of that year. So when I was watching Run, your current film, hear me out on this. I kind of feel like it's a little bit of like a weird parallel cousin to Searching. And both films share an element that have a single parent be in how the single parent in their relationship with their daughter, but Run literally goes the opposite direction, both in terms of story and how the film was made. Do you see the parallels I'm discussing, and was that even mildly intentional at all?
Yeah, it was completely intentional, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So coming off of Searching, for me at least, it was such a unconventional and very modern and very complex and like very sort of like a gimmick we made work, but a gimmick nonetheless of a movie, that I needed to prove to myself that I could do the opposite, that I could like make a normal movie, because I didn't want to be put into this box. And so like when doing the opposite, I wanted to go completely the exact opposite. And in doing so, what we ended up creating was, like what you said, cousins. These movies are talking to each other, just not in the same language. This movie is intentionally two characters, one household, one camera. Like, we're still trying to maintain tension and make it emotional and whatnot, but like it's the exact opposite of the scale. And same with the tone. Like what you're talking about, a single parent. Like the question was, of all of our work prior to up until Searching, was like, a parent's love is great, in some version of that. And now it's like, can a parent love you so much that stops being a hug and starts being a smother? And that question for us started propelling Run. And I think what you end up with are films that are straight up on the polar opposite of spectrum as far as how they make you feel, how simple one is and how complex one is, all intentional. And hopefully on a personal level, doing that in a way I feel like has pros and cons, but one of the pros is that it sort of freed me from feeling like I'm in this box of just being a tech filmmaker.
Oh, that's awesome. So where did the idea for Run come from? How did you two come up with this story?
I mean, it was, like I said, the initial seed of the idea was what Aneesh was talking about, this approach of let's make a movie that has these elements. So what is that movie? And it was, frankly inspired by a lot of true stories that, we've all probably heard of and read and seen. And I know early on there was a lot of conversation of do we want to do this? Is this already being done? And there was this revelation about, we can do this in a way that doesn't portray the victim as a victim. Can we flip the switch and give the young girl at the center of the story, the hero card, and let her be empowered and vanquish herself and not need to be rescued, but rather rescue herself. And a lot of that was interesting. And I think even beyond just the plot mechanics, there was a lot of themes that we were kind of really excited to explore, whether it's what Aneesh was talking about, from the mother's perspective of what does it mean to love too much? And from the daughter's perspective, this idea of wanting freedom and really meaning wanting independence, which, is something universal to all of us. And especially, teenagers or when we were teens. And what does wanting independence look like for this young girl? And the idea that we can kind of do everything we wanted to do in this sandbox, it was really kind of appealing to us. And
and it's funny, I don't want to put too much of a thought on it, but the fact that this film is dropping on Hulu, in which Hulu had the film The Act come out, it's the similarities on just one element alone made me go, that's sort of a weird home that you ended up having this film premiere on. Did that thought cross your mind when the announcement for moving this film to Hulu came to be?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's the decision to go to Hulu was, it definitely crossed our mind, but the decision to go there was not really based on that show. Sure. It was the fact that because of the pandemic, obviously every movie's moving off the theatrical calendar. And then what we're getting now is a backlog of hundreds and hundreds of tentpole movies, and now that Tenet sort of I think to the average studio head has now the average studio head, to the studio head has sort of shown that we're not releasing movies in theaters now until this all returns back to normal. What we're going to get when theaters return back to normal is just like temple after temple after temple after temple after temple after temple. And like, where's Run going to fit in? We're a small movie by studio standards, you know, like we're just an original small film. So the smartest thing for us is to come out now, you know, before this massive sort of break of Tom Cruise movies just goes on a streak. And so from there on, we're thinking like, what's the best place? And like Hulu right now is in a great place. Like you know it for original films for one movie. It's Palm Springs, you know, like, and I think like, it's not a factory yet, you know. It's a movie where like they say they have a movie, and it's actually like it's a deal, you know. Like they're going to put billboards up, they're going to take care of this movie, and I think that was a lot of the biggest decision behind going to Hulu specifically was the fact that like it feels like it is we're like being treated like a singular film here, and and that's pretty exciting. Obviously, the comparisons to the actor, you know, it's hard to sort of not draw the connection there, but we didn't write that movie, so we can't really control that.
But you guys did write this movie. So what was the process like for you to this time out as opposed to like Searching? And what did you learn from when you last worked on Searching? Like what was the difference between like, what was the process from like writing this film and the differences from that from Searching?
Man, great question. I think early on, like the approach to writing was in a lot of ways kind of like a desire to not repeat Searching. You know, like Searching, like, you know, is you know, I'd say like this intricate, elaborate movie that kind of goes in a billion directions and then like somehow just kind of comes back and you're with this father. I mean, it's like so complex, you know, like just by the virtue of it being a mystery detective kind of movie. And we were like, man, let's definitely not do that. You know, like let's keep it simple. Like we truly wanted to just create a really clean palette for Aneesh and the actors to just like drive the story from left to right. You know, we often refer to it as a left to right movie because that's kind of what it is. And what was interesting was that, you know, this movie probably changed quite a bit from the screenplay to its final iteration. And, you know, Searching, obviously, I mean, every movie is going to change. It's part of the natural process. But with this movie, a couple of like major factors influenced that. Which, you know, we shot the film in the city of Winnipeg, Canada, which is a lovely city, but happens to be, I think, the coldest city on the planet, if I'm not mistaken. I think someone said that to me. I certainly felt that. So, like, what was interesting? It's one of them. What's interesting, like Justin, like while we were shooting the movie, like, and this happens on every movie. Oh, X actor needs to suddenly go to this. Okay, let's, you know, blah blah blah. We started to have to rewrite the movie just because of the weather. Like scenes, like, the entire climax of the movie took place outdoors, and we had this like epic. I mean, you know, back to the idea of like freedom. You know, like this epic outdoor thing, and it was like, okay, so I remember what's so funny was like at one point we were like Aneesh, now Kasabian, our producing partner, myself and Sarah Paulson were like huddled trying to figure out how do we rewrite the ending of this movie. And we were like, okay, can we do it in the cold, you know? And like we were talking and like I think one of us mentioned to Sarah, well, you know, Leo DiCaprio shot The Revenant in the freezing cold, and she was like, right, but Leo's character was supposed to be freezing his ass off. And it was like so funny because you're like, okay, good point. Let's rewrite. So like it was, you know, and in addition to that, just like the natural process of this being a studio movie, and it was now like a lot of voices more than ours, of voices that were far more experienced, and you know, like they knew what they were doing. Like we had to make concessions and changes all throughout. And like, and what's funny is like certain elements of the movie that initially we started off saying, let's not do that. We ended up finding ourselves coming back to that because it just felt like that's where the story and the process was taking us. So very interesting roller coaster ride, and we, you know, we're just excited for it to finally come out.
Now I'm going to assume it's not too much of a stretch to assume that like Hitchcock is an inspiration point for this film. What exactly did you like? What things from Hitchcock were you guys wanting to incorporate that you made sure was in the film?
Yeah, two things. Number one, of the cinematography, and number two is the way the narrative unspools. And I think like one thing that Hitchcock is very good at that I think Shyamalan borrowed as well, and it's very Shyamalan visuals that I think that was trying to steal from as well, but like is that like the difference between, I was talking about this earlier, but like the difference between very modern movies and those earlier films is that there's no blood. There's like the tension is like, the tension is not like, is my neck going to get slashed, but rather like, will someone find out that I used this phone to call 411? You know, and I think like those are like, will someone see that I was sneaking through the mail or pulled up something from a shopping bag? You know, those are, and for that to be this type of drama or the type of suspense that sustains you for an entire half of the movie, like that is sort of something that is, I think, less germane to a modern movie than it is a sort of a Hitchcockian film. And so in a lot of ways, we always pitch this movie as like one half Hitchcock, the other half Don't Breathe. You know, and I think like that first half was always like supposed to be this like cat and mouse Cold War game where like the fears are quiet, you know? And I think like that to me is very, very Hitchcockian, what we wanted to borrow aesthetically, like this house we chose, the style, the timelessness of the movie. You know, it's very intentionally, apart from one moment where a character uses a computer, like this movie could take place in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. Like it sort of like has this timelessness to it, I think. And like finally, like the shot design, you know, everything, just like Hitchcock, just like Shyamalan, I just watched their behind the scenes and copied them. It was like I drew out every single frame of this movie by hand, storyboarded it before we shot it, and those were the stills that went out to the crew and everything. And you're trying to pick very intentional frames, not cutting when you like not cutting because you wanted to, but cutting because you had to. You know, and that was always the intention in the film, is to make something very, very like painterly visually.
Now, of course, you did, like, for a movie like this, you definitely have to do a lot of research. What was the research process for you guys to make sure that Chloe's day-to-day was authentic? Because I'm sure that was something that was a big concern when you were writing the script.
Go for it.
Yeah, so we had a lot of people, when we wrote the film, you know, like, obviously we're not disabled writers. So, like, when we wrote the film, we're writing it off of a lot of internet research and vague calls and stuff like that we're basing things off of. But the most amount of tangible change that came into it to make it authentic came from Kira, who plays our lead actor, who's disabled in real life. And like, so to her, like one of the things we did right in the beginning, and all of my rehearsals, I just basically be like, this is open to you to change, to adjust, to make sure that like, this is something that you could see yourself living through in a way, you know, not the plot of the movie, but like the life, you know, like the world that is constructed. It was very important for us that like she could see it. So she had a huge role in designing her room, designing parts of the house, designing parts of like where things were located, designing changes in language, changes in some of the story beats that we felt like we were being taught what ableism was. And we were like adjusting elements of the story to like suggest that her character arc was not complete because of any gaining of ability, but rather because her character gains a certain sense of, or completes her arc in an emotional sense. So like, these are all things that like we opened ourselves up to very much in the beginning, and just was like, hey, this movie is never going to be good unless like you, who've lived a life much closer to the life that this character has, kind of gives you yourself some sort of seal of approval on authenticity. And that's what she helped us with a lot. And like, we basically were like, okay, everything she said was immediately a direction to some department head to change their path.
And you know what's funny is like, we were so lucky because Kira, in addition to being an amazing actress, is also a writer in her own right. I mean, you know, we've read a lot of her stuff and it's pretty freaking amazing. It's kind of intimidating actually. And like, so oftentimes she would give notes that were like keeping in mind the narrative construct that we were trying to go for. I mean, to be frank, like we called her on our final day of our sound mix from Culver City.
Wow.
Like, in her New York City dorm room to be like, hey, this one line we're ADRing, like, is it A or B? So like she gave so much to the film, not only on camera and not only physically, but just even just like narratively.
That's amazing. I got one more question for you folks, and I think it's fair for me to ask. Is there a third film about a single parent thriller to just kind of tie up this trilogy you've created?
And it's called,
you have one in mind. You have one ready.
It's called Hiding. You know, we search, you run, and now you got to be hiding.
Perfect.
No, I don't. I mean, kind of like we have.
There's a single parent in our next movie, and that relationship plays a pretty big role. But it's not as like, it's not about that. Our next film. It's like it's in the background. It's a very important backstory to our lead character, but it's not like about it. But so maybe this is a trilogy that we'll come back to complete. You know, like I think like maybe the next film isn't directly this, but like I do hear you on like it would be cool to kind of make Hyde. You know, like
I will say
that movie is.
Probably the next project of ours that will probably come out next is Searching 2. Which might be a good answer to that question, Justin. But that's one that Aneesh is directing. We wrote the initial story. We're producing along with Natalie Sabian, and we can't wait to announce who our director is because it's going to blow people's socks off. But TBD, TBA.
Awesome. That's exciting, guys. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you both.